Hello, can you all hear me clearly? Yep, super. So, situation normal, everything must change. Before I start, a couple of words of warning. One, I happen to like kitten pictures, so I'll be using a lot of these in the presentation. Secondly, I'm a scientist by training, which means I like graphs. Here's a quick graph, the level of audience pain, that's you, against the number of slides given in a 40-minute presentation, to which I reckon there's a safe limit of around about 30 slides. And being a scientist, I like to experiment. I'll be using no less than 298. I know what you're probably thinking, but don't worry if you do get a bit lost. There'll be plenty of signposts along the way. Now, signpost is the right word because what I'm going to talk about is mapping. I'm going to talk about why maps are important in business. I'm going to talk about how do you map a business. I'm going to talk about some of the rules of economic change. I'm going to use all of this to explain cloud computing and what is happening. Then I'm going to show you how you do some of the gameplay, so how you manipulate markets to your favor. And then hopefully at the end, I'm going to wrap it all up with some simple question and a simple tip. Now, before I start, and this is very cruel because I know there was a free bar last night, I'm going to ask a question. Do you have a business IT strategy? Yes, no, or all of the above? Who's for yes? Okay. Who's for no? Okay. Who's for all of the above? Right. Cowards. So most times I go into an organization and they show me some sort of big strategy document. I find these very interesting. What I do is I rip out from this document any purchasing decisions, any sort of implementation details, any operational details, any tactical choices, because all of that stuff is all about the how, what, and when. And then what I'm left with is the why, and it's generally very small, and it's generally very vague. And in fact, for most companies, the reason why they're doing something is because 67% of other companies are doing it. So everybody else is doing big data, we should do big data. Everybody else is doing social media, so should we. Everybody else is doing cloud, so should we. So I often ask the question, why does a general bombard a hill? Does a general bombard a hill because 67% of other successful generals are bombarding hills, and therefore that's what you should do, find a hill and bombard it? Or is it because they use a map? Maps are incredibly useful things. They tell you where you can attack. Why is a relative statement, so why here, over there. And after you've got the why, then you're into the how, what, and when. So in military terms, strategy is about where, why, how, what, and when. In business, unfortunately, because we don't have a map, we have a tyranny of how, what, and when. Does that sound familiar? Everybody's been quiet. Well, does it matter, is the first question you should ask. So a couple of years ago, I did a piece of work which looked at the level of strategic play between companies against their use of open as a mechanism to compete. It's a bubble diagram. The bigger the bubbles, the more companies in that group. And it turned out there were players, highly strategic, used open to manipulate markets. Thinkers, highly strategic, tended to not use open. Believers, not very strategic, tended to use open by default. And chancers who did neither. Now, what was interesting is the companies in the top right-hand side, market cap over the last 7 years has grown significantly, whereas these companies down the bottom, well, some of them managed to make themselves bankrupt during the time which we were doing the survey. So it seems to be a case that what's going on is there is a game of chess between companies, and unfortunately some of those companies can't see the board, and it seems to have an impact. So how do you map out this environment? How do you see the board that you're competing on? Well, unfortunately, organizations are complex things, a mass of activities, practices, people, and data. And the way we generally look at organization is through sort of block and wire diagrams, whether it's process or whether it's IT systems. And they're great for connecting and wiring things up, but they tell you nothing about need. They tell you nothing about change. They tell you nothing about how to manage an environment. An alternative way of looking at organization is through mapping out value chains. So value chains is based upon the visible need that you're providing to a customer to the invisible components that you worry about to make that need happen. So for example, this is a company called Fatango. It was a massive online photo service in 2005. At the top is the customer need, online image storage, image manipulation. Underneath this are all the components needed to provide that. So things like compute, customer relationship management systems, data centers, power. Now, these diagrams are slightly better because they focus on need, but they tell you nothing about change or how to manage an environment. And the problem, of course, with value chains is they don't stand still. If you look at Nokia, it was a paper mill company, became a plastics manufacturer, became a telecommunications company, not quite sure what it's becoming today. And we often think, this occurs because new things appear, innovations, telephone, internet, whatever it happens to be. This diffused from early adopters to laggards, and this whole process is all random. Well, fortunately, it's not as random as we'd like to believe. Because what happens is things not only appear, they tend to evolve. You start off with a phone, you end up with a better phone. Or in the case of electricity, you start off with a Parthian battery around about 400 AD. Over time, you get utility provision with Westinghouse. Now, there is a common pattern for how things evolve. You can map it by looking at the ubiquity of something against certainty, so how widespread against how well-defined. And it starts off with the genesis of an activity, custom-built examples, products and rental services, commodity and utility services. So if you take electricity, Parthian battery, then you've got custom-built systems, Hippolyte Pixie, Siemens generators, eventually utility provision of electricity. If you take computing, you've got the Z3 in 1943, things like Leo, custom-built systems like Leo, then products, IBM 650, onto rental services like TimShare, commodity hardware, and eventually utility services, i.e. cloud, today. Now, causation is an essential, you've got correlation. You need to understand why this occurs. And what drives this process is competition. So if you think about business as a cat fight, anytime anybody gains some sort of technological advantage, some new big gun like an e-commerce system, then everybody else wants to follow suit. And so what you have is competition driving the demand for anything which is useful. But at the same time, vendors are trying to supply this stuff, and anytime anybody introduces a new thing like kit and body armor, someone will make a better version. And so what you have is supply competition driving completeness. So I have two things here. I have value chain, which describes an organization, and evolution, which describes change. So what if I combine those together? This is what I did back in 2005. We took the value chain of Fatango. I happened to be CEO of this company. And we mapped out all the components against how evolved they were. And that generated a map. So at the bottom of the map, you've got things like power, very much a commodity, compute, very much late product, things like online image storage, image manipulation, very much sort of early stage custom-built examples. Now, this is slightly better because it gives us need and some idea of change, but it doesn't really tell us how to manage that environment. In order to manage it, we need to understand the rules of the game. But I'm going to quickly recap. Organizations, complex things, masses of people, activities, and processes. You can actually look at it in a different way to the normal block and wire diagram by drawing out value chains. Value chains, though, only get you half the way because value chains don't stand still. Organizations evolve. Fortunately, there is a common pattern for how things evolve. So you can take those two things and combine them together to create a map of an organization. Now I'm going to talk about the rules of the game. Rule one is everything evolves. Everything on your environment is constantly evolving from genesis to more of a commodity due to competition. It only doesn't evolve when you don't have competition in your industry. Two, competition changes everything. So if I take something like penicillin, which started off very much left-hand side, Genesis, then custom-built examples. It starts off with a set of particular characteristics. It's chaotic, it's uncertain, it's poorly understood, it's unpredictable, it's changing, it's different. We're learning how to use this stuff. It's a potential source of future worth. It seems to be exciting. Then over time, as it evolves, it becomes much more industrialized, ordered, known, measured, standard, stable, predictable, dull, even low margin. Becomes, it's more of a commodity. So whenever you look at an organization, all its components are evolving due to competition, but they're also changing in terms of characteristics. Rule 3, one size never fits all. Because of those changing characteristics from uncharted to industrialized, there's no such thing as a management method which is applicable across the board. So agile development, for example, very good in the uncharted world, less so in the more industrialized side compared to something like Six Sigma. Six Sigma is very strong in the industrialized, weak in the uncharted. So whenever you map out an organization, some parts of it need to be agile in-house, some parts of it need to be Six Sigma sort of outsourced. And of course, all of this stuff is evolving from left to right. So if I give an example, this is a very large engineering project, HS2 in the UK. This is a map of their environment, customers at the top, all the different components at different stages of evolution. Some of those components are suitable for outsourcing to utility providers. Some of them are suitable for use of off-the-shelf products, whilst others are suitable for in-house development. Whenever we do the one-size-fits-all methodology, it always creates problems. So if you decide to outsource everything, it's efficient on the far right-hand side, you'll get hammered by change control cost on the left-hand side. And then the same problem if you decide to go all agile. You'll be very effective on the left-hand side, but inefficient on the right. Okay, rule 4, efficiency enables innovation. Whenever anything evolves, electricity from Siemens generators to utility provision, we think of it as about efficiency. But it also enables the rapid development of higher order system. So we needed utility electricity to have things like radio, television, electric lighting. Now that's an effect known as componentization, Herbert Simon's theory of hierarchy. And if you think of it like this, nuts and bolts used to be made in cottage industries. Handmade, one nut fitted one bolt, no other. Wardley introduced the screw cutting lathe. You suddenly got an explosion in standard nuts and bolts, and as a result, you got an explosion of higher order systems, i.e. machinery. And that's a common effect throughout history. Now, these higher order systems also tend to be where new value is created, worth. So television is the new industry to worry about. And so that's the effect of competition. It always drives something to become more efficient, more of a commodity, but enables the development of higher order systems, which is also where we find new sources of value or worth. And throughout history, that's been the story. Electricity-enabled computing. As computing has commoditized more, it's enabled larger scale analytic systems. As analytic systems are commoditizing, we're getting things like intelligent software agents, Google Now, Mind Meld, etc. Rule 5, choice is an illusion. Efficiency, agility, worth are powerful forces. If you're in competition with somebody else and they're more agile, more efficient, more able to extract worth than you, that's a really sort of negative advantage to have, particularly as more of your competitors adapt to that new world. Now, this creates what's known as the Red Queen effect. This is the need to continuously evolve in order to stand still relative to a surrounding ecosystem. So as things become more commodity, as your competitors adapt, you have to adapt. Rule 6, we have inertia. We don't like change. If I take something like compute as a product, when it was a product, we developed architectural practices based upon the idea of product, based upon that physical concept. And these were novel practices, things like scale up and N+1, and they spread and became best practice for that product world. But what happened is compute evolved. It's become more of a utility. And a range of new novel practices appeared, not based upon bigger hardware, but volume operations of small, more commodity, good enough components. These are things like scale out, design for failure, chaos engines or chaos monkeys. And that's spread, and they've become best practice for that utility world. Now, you often get this coevolution of practice with activity. And it creates a problem because the past is what we call the legacy estate. Doesn't matter whether I'm talking about machinery or computing. Legacy basically means built with best practice for the past way of providing that activity. And then, of course, you've got the new estate, or what we like to call DevOps today. And of course, we always want to move from one to another because we want those benefits of efficiency, agility, new sources of work. And so what happens is people take legacy applications and they stick them into that new environment. Amazon has an outage, and they all run around screaming, "The end of cloud is nigh." Well, the answer is, shouldn't our architecture evolve as well? To which the response is normally fairly negative. And the reason why the answer is negative is mainly because there's a cost associated with going from a legacy estate to this new estate. And that's one of the forms, and there's many forms of inertia that organizations create. Of course, inertia also means opportunities for others. So you'll hear a lot of people say, what you need is enterprise cloud. Enterprise cloud, yay. Scotty, I want an enterprise cloud. I want all the benefits of volume operations using commodity components, but built with non-commodity hardware customized to my needs. You cannot change the laws of physics, I'm afraid. So don't worry, we have private cloud for you. Yay, private cloud, same problem. Yes, hugging my tree will make it grow as big as the Amazon. Private cloud is often, I want to keep my server. Anyway, so what we now have today is what you need is software-defined data centers. What happened with private and enterprise cloud then? The reality is you don't get a choice about this. Those competitive pressures of efficiency, agility, new sources of work will force you to adapt to a more public model. If I look back to the 1980s to today, for $1,000, I get 1,000,000 times more compute resource. Does that mean that during that time, my IT budget has reduced 1,000,000-fold? No, I've just ended up doing more stuff. As your competitors are using more efficient forms, they're not going to save money, they're just going to do more stuff than you. And that's where the problem occurs. So this is why these changes always start as a trickle, the pressure builds, and then suddenly it becomes a flood, and everybody moves to the cloud. Okay, rule 7, inertia kills. It's not just customers, but vendors have inertia. Their inertia comes from past business models. They get very successful at selling you products. They want that model to continue forever. They rarely see the flood of change that's coming. And that's because we get used to more linear concepts of change. And by that, this is the analyst estimates for AWS revenue over the last 6-7 years. It's about 3% worldwide server market. Now, if I asked you going forward, where do you think they'll be by 2016, you'd probably say about 6% based upon how they've been doing. But that's a linear model of change. If you simply apply the actual growth rate they have per year, you'll end up with a figure more like this, somewhere between 30 and 50%. This is known as a punctuated equilibrium. It's a period of rapid change caused by exponential growth, which we are often not suspecting, where we're not planning for, because we get stuck in sort of concepts of linear change. And this can be quite fatal for companies. So if I look at cameras, we went from analog to digital. Kodak was first in there with online photos, with digital still cameras. Unfortunately, they had inertia because of their fulfillment systems. They were all based upon producing analog photos. That's how they made their money. That inertia slowed them down. They were unable to react. The same happened with Blockbuster and Netflix. Blockbuster was the first with video on demand, but unfortunately had its stores, and that held it back. But we always tell ourselves, don't worry, IT change is slower. It's not going to happen. Well, unfortunately, we have to contend with economic cycles. So what happens is, as anything evolves, doesn't matter whether it's computing infrastructure, nuts and bolts, money, whatever it is, it goes through discrete phases. You have a relatively peaceful state of competition, And I mean relatively peaceful in terms of vendor number one, vendor number two jostling for position. Those companies build up inertia to change because of their successful business models. But the act becomes suitable for more utility provision. It is extremely rare that it's one of those companies who will push the market towards utility provision. It's almost always an outside force who will introduce that phase and create the war. Now, in this war, you're going to see disruption of past industries, a period of rapid change, what is known as a punctuated equilibrium. And after that, you're going to experience an explosion of growth of higher order systems, so electricity enabling radio, television, etc. Now, that pattern of peace, war, and wonder occurs at both local and a macroeconomic scale. And a macro scale, we call them K-waves, Kondratiev waves. Wonder, peace, and war, or more commonly we call them ages, like the industrial age or the age of electricity. Now, these never start with the innovation of something. Electricity didn't start with a Parthian battery in 400 AD. They always start with the commoditization of a pre-existing act, so Westinghouse utility provision. It wasn't, by the way, Edison. Edison went around saying AC is rubbish, tried to get it banned by Congress, failed, bought out Westinghouse and reinvented himself as the father of the AC utility, but that's a different story. Now, what happens with this commoditization is then you get an explosion of higher order systems, you get these new industries forming, Hollywood, teletyping, you get the time of wonder, the dreams of magic. Unless you happen to be somebody like a gas lamp lighter, somebody involved in those past industries, in which case it's pretty miserable. Oh, you're in the textile industry where it's all changing. You also get new forms of organization appear, and that pattern repeats throughout history. So the mechanical age was all about commoditization of mechanical components, disruption of past industries, new forms of organization, new forms of practice. The internet age is all about commoditization of the means of mass communication, disruption of past industries stuck behind inertia barriers, explosion of higher order systems, new forms of practice, new forms of organization. That's rule 9, and this is the final rule. There's about 50, but I'm not going to go through them all. Rule 9 is organizations evolve. Whenever these acts change and you get this coevolution of practice, you also go from that stage of peace to that stage of war. And what happens is past organization and past practices tend to die off, and new forms of organization and new practice dominate. So in the electricity age, we got Fordism. In the mechanical age, we got the American system. In the internet age, we got Web 2.0. In cloud, we're actually getting a new form as well. But I'm going to quickly recap first. Organizations, massive activities, practices, and data. It's quite complex, but you can map it out by first looking at a value chain. But the problem with value chains alone is they don't stand still. Nokia was a paper company, then a plastics company. Fortunately, the process of evolution isn't random. There is a pattern to this, and so you can combine those two things, a value chain and evolution, to create a map. Now, having a map is one thing. You now need to sort of understand the rules of the game. Rule 1 is that everything evolves due to competition. As it evolves, its characteristics change. It goes from this uncharted, uncertain world to being more industrialized, more predictable. Rule 3 is no single-size methods of management. You have to take into consideration that any organization is a mass of evolving activities, so you need both Agile and both Six Sigma, depending upon what you're doing. Rule 4 is that as things evolve, become more efficient, they enable higher order systems to appear. Rule 5 is choice is an illusion. When you're competing against others, using a more evolved form, they have the benefits of efficiency, agility, new sources of worth, so you have to adapt. Rule 6, we have inertia to the change, mainly because of legacy. Rule 7 is, unfortunately, the legacy tends to kill. Inertia is extremely dangerous to organizations. Rule 8, the economy goes through cycles or states, peace, war, and wonder, and that occurs both at a local and macro scale. And Rule 9 is that organizations also evolve through this process. So I'm now going to quickly talk about cloud. Cloud is very simple. It's a shift from product to utility of a range of IT activities, and that is it. The effects of it are standard. It's about efficiency, agility, and new sources of worth. Yes, we have inertia to cloud. That's perfectly normal. But no, you don't have a choice. It's not a question of if, it's only a question, and has only been a question of when. It's also about an economic state change, going from a state of relatively peaceful competition to a state of war. This is why CEOs of these companies run around talking about the war in IT. And of course, this is all brand new, except for it was written about in 1966 by a chap called Douglas Parkhill in The Challenge of the Computer Utility. We've had 47 years to prepare for this change. It is all perfectly normal. Now, of course, in this process, new forms of organization are appearing, and they have a different set of characteristics to traditional forms of organization. Now, these new forms, some of them are relatively small, some of them are 100 billion market cap monsters. And they are different. So, structure. Traditional, very much departmental. These are service cell-based type structures. Open source, traditionally, it's about cost reduction. They use it as a weapon. Resilience, we talk about N+1. They talk about design for failure. Techniques, we talk about single. We're an agile shop. We're a Six Sigma shop. These people use multiple techniques. Infrastructure, we talk about enterprise class. They're based upon commodity. And the most interesting one of those is their use of ecosystems. So in the past, do you know Porter? Okay, so Porter competitive strategy, choose one. Be highly innovative, highly efficient, highly customer focused. Brilliant for the 1980s, bust today. If you look at somebody like Amazon, what they do is they take a product, they make it more of a utility. They build an ecosystem around that. And by that, I mean they are a supplier and people are building on top of what they're providing. So, for example, they provide EC2, people produce big data systems. Now, as those systems start to diffuse, Amazon can leverage that through consumption data to spot what is diffusing. That enables them to commoditize it to new component services, things like Elastic MapReduce, which then people build on top of. Now, that's a model known as innovate, leverage, commoditize. You get other people to innovate for you, you leverage the ecosystem to spot what is diffusing, and then you commoditize it to new component services. And the effect of this is several-fold. But I just want to mention about the uncharted and industrialized. By being a first mover to commoditize something, you immediately create stable, predictable revenues for yourself. But by enabling other people to innovate for you and then leveraging that ecosystem to spot diffusion, you're constantly in a position of being a fast follower to the novel and new. So the net effects of this is you get stable revenue, you maximize your opportunities, your rate of apparent innovation increases with the size of the ecosystem because everybody's innovating for you. Your customer focus and your efficiency also increase with the size of the ecosystem. So that old model of choose one is completely bust. You choose all three plus another two. And that's why when you look at somebody like AWS, as they're getting bigger, their rate of innovation, rate of customer focus, rate of efficiency isn't slowing down, it's accelerating. So quick recap. You can use value chains and the concept of evolution to map out an organization. But maps are useful. They tell you about need and change. But in order to manage the environment, you have to understand the rules of the game. 1, everything evolves. 2, characteristics change. 3, one size doesn't fit all. 4, efficiency enables innovation. 5, choice is an illusion. 6, we have inertia. 7, inertia kills. 8, the economy has cycles. 9, organizations evolve due to this process. When you look at something like cloud, it is simply a shift from product to utility of a range of activities in IT, nothing more. It has all the normal effects. Efficiency, enabling higher order systems to appear, new sources of worth to be created and changing practices. It also enables new forms of organization. That's what we see today. This is a piece of work actually from 2010. The characteristics of these organizations are different. They are not the same as traditional. One of the most interesting aspects about them is their use of ecosystems, entirely new models of business based upon this. So who cares? Why does this matter to me? Well, this bit I'm going to talk about gameplay. When you're playing a game of chess, and competition between companies is nothing more than this, you need to understand the board, i.e. the game that you are playing, i.e. the map, the rules, how economic change is going to impact you, and then you need to be able to play the game. You need to be able to move the pieces. One of the interesting characteristic changes is open source. So we've gone from a world of where we think about open source as cost reduction to a world where we think about open source as a weapon, as a way of manipulating markets. Open approaches, and it doesn't matter whether it's source, hardware, or data, have a common characteristic. They drive things to more of a commodity. So if you're Google, there's your data value chain. You're under threat from iOS. You drive that operating system to more of a commodity. You build an ecosystem around Android to compete against iOS. Competition now changes. It goes to what is built upon top of this, which inherently, because it's novel and new, is uncertain. Now, a lot of people tell me that Apple is no longer the innovative company that it once was. That's not the problem for Apple. The rate of change of innovation of Apple hasn't changed that much. The problem for Apple is it's been out-innovated by the ecosystem around Android. So back in 2005, the map of the company that I used to run, we used this to identify where things were going to change. We picked one of these, platform. So in 2005, we knew we would get platform as a service. We knew people would have inertia, that there would be efficiency, agility, new sources of worth. We could build an ecosystem in that space, and we guessed that somebody else would do a compute play. I thought it was Google. It turned out next year it was Amazon. By using the mapping, we were able to understand why we should attack platform rather than any of the other opportunities. Open source, we use that deliberately to overcome inertia and to drive to form a competitive market. So what we had was where, why, and how. The what and when simply came afterwards. In 2008, I worked at Canonical. We were fighting Red Hat, so Ubuntu, Red Hat on the server OS. We knew that compute was going to head towards a utility. And therefore, we decided to attack all the spaces which came from that. So the guest OS, platform, DevOps space, new application development. So back in 2008, Red Hat dominated on the server. But today, Ubuntu dominates in terms of the cloud. 2012, we played the same games, heavy engineering project, and also within governments. So I now want to summarize to a couple of points. You are living in a world where IT is a strategic weapon. When people talk about IT eating the world, it is eating the world. It's impacting all sorts of different industries. But it's also a tool that you can use. Now, people talk about why we're trying to follow his game of checkers. Jeff Bezos is playing chess. It's really important to understand the game that you are playing. And that means understanding the board. Things like this, the old sort of block and wire diagrams, won't give you this information. Mapping is one of many techniques which hopefully will. Now, it's okay to play a game of chess blindfolded as long as all your competitors are doing exactly the same. The problem is people have adapted. There are a lot more strategic thinking companies out there. They use things like open source. They use things like ecosystems to manipulate markets. And before you say, this doesn't affect me, I'm a hardware company, the cycle of change, the disruption caused by commoditization, the new practices will affect manufacturing through 3D printing. These same games will impact you. So the one question that I have for you is at the beginning, I said, do you have a business IT strategy? The question I want to ask is, if you do you actually have a tyranny of the how, what, and when? Do you have very little of the why in your strategy? In which case, can I strongly suggest to you that you spend a little bit of time trying to map out the environment and see how the game is being played. The one tip I have for you is that mapping is really simple. That's all you need to know. You just need to map out your value chain and consider how evolved the components are. You can share it with other people in your company. You are playing the game of chess. You need to understand the board, you need to understand the rules, you need to learn how to play the game. But you need to do this. No consultant, no outside advisor, no fortune teller, no any of these will give you that advice. This is only something that you can do. You need to have experience of your business. You just simply need to start mapping out and considering how that game is being changed. Thank you very much.